Reggie here, your friendly neighborhood bodybuilder and comic book collector, and I want to welcome you to another one of my videos. In this video, we are going to count down 5 practical tips for why you should focus on the book and not the grade when buying slabbed comics. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about CBCS, CGC, EGS, Halo, or any of the others that are out there. This is a video that I think will be helpful for you if you are buying graded comics or even thinking about buying graded comics. And in many ways, this video is a continuation of a conversation that I actually started on the GoCollect channel. A few weeks ago, I released a video over there basically highlighting that not all 9.8s are created the same. And so this is very much a continuation of that conversation. Before I get to the 5 practical tips, I want to acknowledge the sponsor of this video, Hip Comic. If you haven't yet had a chance to visit this website, I definitely want to encourage you to do so today. This is a wonderful platform for buying and selling comics. It's a platform that was built for collectors by collectors. And I promise you that if you head over to their site, link in the description, you are not going to be disappointed by the functionality or the selection that you are going to find. With that said, let's get to the list. Tip number 1, take the time to familiarize yourself with the grading criteria for the grading company's book that you happen to be buying. For example, if you are buying a CBCS book, make sure that you go to their website and look at how they define that specific grade, the defects that that grade can have. If you're buying a CGC book, do the same. PGX, EGS, take the time to familiarize yourself for what constitutes the grades. What you're probably going to see is that the grading companies evaluate the individual grades a little bit differently. They also present the data slightly differently on their website. For example, when you go to CBCS's website, what you see is that they essentially group 9.0 all the way down to 7.5 together in one description with some bullets. And so that's a big grouping that they're kind of lumping together. But the good thing is that they do provide a healthy amount of detail for what constitutes that grouping versus the next grouping. When you go to CGC's website, they break out each individual half grade, but they don't provide as much detail as what you're going to get on the CBCS website. My point here is that you want to take time. If you're buying a graded book and you're spending your hard-earned money, make sure you know what it is that you're actually buying, because it could be different from grading company to grading company. Tip number 2 is to know the differences between how the grading companies look at the individual grades. And yes, this is very much a piggyback off of tip number 1, but it's an important thing that has to be mentioned. All of the grading companies essentially use Overstreet as their foundation. But over the years, a lot of the grading companies interpret some of what Overstreet did a little bit differently. They've adapted it. They've grandfathered certain things out. And so because of that, there are some minor differences in how they will grade a book. And yes, some people will say that it's a bad evolution, but it is what it is. And so you definitely want to understand the nuanced differences that exist between the grading companies. And I always like to point out the fact that grading a comic is part art and part science, and everyone has a different calculation for how they mix those two things together. And so if you're going after a CGC book, you definitely want to understand what constitutes that grade and how does that compare to another book from another grading company that you might also be considering purchasing. Tip number 3 is an important one, and the tip is to look beyond the label. That's like the whole point of this video. But specifically, you want to look at the comic that you're thinking about buying front and back. You want to look at it through the plastic, and you want to understand the defects that are being shown to you. And it can be difficult to examine a book through the plastic, but it's possible to do it. And once you observe the defects, you then read the label or you get the grader's notes to understand again, what did the grader see when they actually graded this specific book? My point here is that there are lots of reasons why a comic, for example, could get a 7.0. The question is, which defects does your book have that resulted in it getting the 7.0? You want to understand those defects so you know what it is that you're actually buying, because it's not just one thing. It could be a combination of things that could result in that book having that specific grade. The next tip is to make trade-offs. And what I mean by that, and I've mentioned this already, is that there are a lot of ways that a book can get the grade that it has. And the question becomes, which of those defects are most acceptable to you? Personally, I try to get the best presenting book that I can possibly afford. That is, of course, complete. I once had an opportunity to buy X-Men 94. I had a 7.5 and I had an 8.0 in my hand. And the logical thing might be to get the 8.0 because the price wasn't all that different from the 7.5. But when you look at those two books side by side, what I realized was that the 7.5 actually presented better than the 8.0. The 7.5 had pressable defects that can be corrected, but the colors were more vibrant, in my opinion, than the 8.0, and the price was a little bit better on the 7.5. So it made sense for me to get the 7.5 to eventually get that book pressed to try to get a grade bump, because the vibrancy of the colors isn't necessarily something that can be fixed like pressable defects, for example. And the 7.5 that I picked up also had a better wrap and was therefore a little better centered than the 8.0. So again, you want to take the time to look at these books. You want to take the time to evaluate what matters most to you and then buy the book that meets those criteria. Tip number 5 is to be prepared to shop around. And what I mean by this is that you could be going after a really nice comic that is a 5.5. And what you might actually see is that someone has a higher price for that 5.5 versus someone else. And by taking the time to actually look at the book, look at the label, and to dig in, what you might actually find is that there is a reason for the price difference between two books that have the exact same grade. Of course, it could be CGC versus CBCS or PGX or something like that. Yes, it could be that. Yes, it could also be a color difference, white pages versus off-white pages. But it could also be how that book actually presents. And that could be the driving force behind the price difference. You could have one book that might actually present better, be better centered, have a better wrap versus another that may be a little faded from the sun, but still is a 5.5. And so again, you want to take the time to dig deep, to go beyond the surface and really understand what it is that you are buying, because it's not all just about that label. So there you have it. Those are my 5 practical tips for why you should buy the book and not the label. If you enjoyed this video, I certainly want to encourage you to go ahead and hit the thumbs up button. Leave a comment behind because it is good for the algorithm. Speaking of good, make sure you check out the sponsor of this video, Hip Comic. There is a link down in the description. And if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel for some reason or another, I definitely want to encourage you to go ahead and hit the subscribe button. That way you don't miss out on any of the content that I release from the channel every single week. If you need to reach out to me, feel free to do so on Instagram at Regie Collects.